Greetings, Nibbles, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Let's talk about a weird little guy. In its first 100 or so issues, many comic strips would grace the pages of Games Workshop's White Dwarf magazine. This started in issue 1 with The Keeper of the Flame, a comic so good it never even made it to issue 2. By issue 5 there would be Calgar, no not that one, a sword and sorcery comic that would run until issue 9 and answered the age-old burning question, has White Dwarf ever had a sex scene in it? The answer being, yes, but both participants looked a little bored.
There was also a comic based on the Traveller RPG, and there was Derrick the Troll, a comic that felt like it came from the Beano but was actually previously in Warlock magazine, and received so much negative feedback for its perceived childish humour that it was acknowledged in the strip itself, where Derrick called the complaining readers spotty Herberts who play games pretending to be heroic warriors.
Which, granted, whilst broadly true, is probably not the best way to ingratiate yourself with an audience that already didn't like you.
Derrick the Troll did not last very long in White Dwarf. But there's two long-running strips that stand out from all these others simply by the merit of their longevity. Thrud, a comic about a large barbarian with a tiny head, and, the subject of this particular video, Gobbledigook. Gobbledigook was a comic by Bill Sedgwick about the eponymous goblin Gobbledigook. The strip follows his misadventures in a generic fantasy world that occasionally bears resemblance to the Warhammer Fantasy one, if you squint. It's a world populated by all the various fantasy races and tropes you associate with that kind of setting. Orcs, wizards, mustachioed men, and small pants, you know, the whole shebang. The main goblin himself is a horrible little bugger, violent, petty, and always ready to hurl an insult or start a fight.
Before we go any further, we do just want to note that in the strip, Gobbledigook's name is normally just shortened to the very last bit of it. But since in a lot of places that is considered a slur and we play to an international audience, we will be avoiding saying it out loud during this video. But it is unavoidable that it's going to appear on screen just because it's all over the strip. This isn't a judgment on Sedgwick or anything, the word just doesn't have quite the same impact here in the UK, so it's likely that he never even realised.
Oh, look at Snipe and Wib self-censoring just because they don't want to say a slur.
The comic was initially announced in issue 42 of White Dwarf in 1983, and the first strip would appear in the following issue. It would be a simple 4-panel comic where Gobbledigook lays in wait for a hobbit thinking about how he's going to cook him, whilst the hobbit is, unbeknownst to our bold hero, eaten by an ogre, and so he's going to have quite a shock when he tries to club what comes around the corner. This first strip introduces several elements that will become key to the Gobbledigook strip. 1. Casual violence being inflicted upon everybody. 2. His small hairy partner Nibble, who is often present but rarely ever matters. He's kinda like a small hairy squig. And 3. It's not particularly funny.
Now, of course, all humour is subjective, so if you genuinely find these funny, then you do you, that's fine. I mean, you've seen what we consider funny, But from what was said later in the White Dwarf letter column, it didn't seem to get a wholly warm reception. So we're not alone in thinking it wasn't all that funny. But we're not here to judge the comic. Well, we're not here to just do that, we're here to take you through its run and see if it ever really found its feet. The comic would continue for a couple of years with this format, fleshing out the character and his place in the world. We find out he's an underling to the evil wizard, Wizzelevard, and that his desire to eat hobbits wasn't a one-time thing, and that he canonically has a really hard head.
Ready, Goblin?
Yeah.
Ready, Orc?
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 10! Gobbledigook has the hardest head.
He also seems to exist as a random enemy in a dungeon for D&D parties to wander through. Like in this strip where he and a group of fellow goblins are beaten up by a group of murder hobos. It's unclear if this dungeon is related to Wizzelevard, or his goblin tribe, or an entirely separate side gig he has. Although his main calling seems to be wandering the world, insulting and or assaulting people to varying levels of success.
Elf! Elf! Yeah, you bumped up pixie, you can't get me. Oh.
One quite interesting strip is the last of this format from White Dwarf issue 67.
The trouble with only having 4 frames is that there's not even room to swing a hobbit.
Which is fun because, well, after this, he would have room to swing a hobbit, as the strip would, starting from the next one in issue 68, go to a full-page format. This not only allowed the strip to get more elaborate, but also changed the kind of jokes it could tell. A 4-panel strip is usually dedicated to making just one joke, all leading up to the punchline in the final panel, whereas a full page is free to have a bit of ebb and flow and tell a more complete story. So, when he and his mates eat a hobbit, it's purely incidental, as the strip is actually about how, if you're seeing goblins running around a dungeon, then they're probably just going to the pub. Or when he spends some time wildly attacking gnomes for some reason, the strip has room to let him get his comeuppance from a giant by the end of the page.
Oh, and he and his mates eat a horse one time, so that's a thing we have to deal with. The horse's name was Harold, by the way. Keyword was.
Unfortunately, this era was where one of the strip's biggest issues starts to become unavoidable. Sedgwick had this habit of cramming a lot of chunky detail into his frames, and when combined with the Goblin's slightly distorted manner of speech, the stark black and white printing, and his increasing habit of having the panels blend into one another, the strip could become kinda hard to follow. Maybe it's just us, but we find it really hard to focus on any one thing here, it just all blends into a mush of details. And they would get even more difficult to comprehend when the strip slimmed down to half a page in issue 80, as this is around the time he started experimenting with his layouts, which can lead to you having trouble discerning on what order you're even supposed to read the panels on top of all those existing issues.
But with that said, the strip really did start to take on a very unique, chaotic look. Not an inch of page was wasted, something was always going on. And in the moments where he got to represent a large group of characters, it almost takes on a sort of Where's Wally vibe, where there's so many fun details to pore over. By issue 82, we start to see the thing that will be a defining trait of the later era of Gobbledigook, having him interact with other GW things. This starts with him meeting up with Thrud, who tries to murder Gobbledigook and his gang before taking aim at his previously established, very hard skull with his axe.
Goblin's heads is hard as steel. Hope he's got a good grinding wheel.
My blade's blunt, the little runt.
The joke is, you think he's gonna say cut.
The comic would go back to its full-page spread by issue 88, and by this point I think we've reached what you could call full Gobbledigook. Packed pages of pandemonium that are kinda hard to follow, but are so definitely doing their own thing that they're quite charming. Notably, in issue 90, Gobbledigook ends up descending Dante-like through the various circles of the Games Workshop design studio, being threatened to be boxed up with the other goblins, assaulted with dice, told his design doesn't look right for a goblin, and painted before coming face to face with the boss? Brian Ansell? Maybe?
Hi, I want your thoughts. Well, perhaps not.
Bill, did something happen to you when you went to Games Workshop HQ? Are you okay?
Around this time, a few strips were also dedicated to a script writing competition, where people could win 50 quid, a White Dwarf subscription, and a unique Gobbledigook sketch. The winners were then drawn by Sedgwick, and it gives us a few interesting moments, like Gobbledigook seeing a damsel in distress trapped in a high tower, and getting her down by shooting her in the head. Also, in another one of the submitted scripts, a snotling says this to him.
Gobbledigook, you gotta come!
However, after that we reached Gobbledigook's shining hour, its magnum opus, when for 3 issues between late 1987 and early 1988, it just became a Warhammer 40,000 strip. It starts with Gobbledigook being summoned by Wizzelevard, who has a portal to another dimension in his toilet, as one does. Whether this dimension is past or present, he doesn't know. But what he does know is that he's dunking Gobbledigook in there to take a look around. Passing through the portal, he gains shading and wakes up at the feet of a space marine and his squad, who laugh at the grotty little Gretchen. Enraged and reaching for something to throw, he picks up a discarded gun and throws it at the marine, who continues laughing until the gun goes off, firing a small pellet that daintily lands on his head, incinerating it. This causes the rest of the marines to open fire and the little goblin is forced to run for cover. In the second page, a few issues later, he's saved by a giant tank who kills all the marines before a Gretchen pops their head out, who is... okay, how do I put this delicately? Okay, in between the comedy German accent and the toothbrush moustache, I think this is supposed to be Goblin Hitler. So, we have another of the boys, Hein. I am the Gretchen Panzergroße Honcho.
You what?
Although, since one of the goblins here looks like a rebel grot, we can only assume there's some kind of Molotov ribbon grot pact going on here.
Look, I'm proud of that joke, I don't really care if you find it funny or not.
This strip also features Wizzelevard sending another goblin, who's a reoccurring character called Gump, by the way, to help Gobbledigook. And we see him change from his usual design into one more befitting 40k as he passes through the portal, with his trademark haircut morphing into a helmet. We don't mention this because it's important to the story, it might as well not be there. We mention it because it made us realise that Gobbledigook's design subtly changed too. He's now wearing the most grimdark footwear possible. A pair of Converse.
Now, this might seem like a completely random choice, but there might actually be some logic behind it.
The very first 40k Gretchen model, the imaginatively named 1987 Space Goblin, who I'm fairly sure was the only 40k Gretchen model available at the time these comics were published, had some little round bits on his shoes that, when combined with the toe cap on one of them, does make them look a little Converse-like if you paint them in a certain way.
Now, I'm not saying that that is definitely what Cedric was thinking of when he drew it, I don't know, but what I am saying is that there is the possibility that it wasn't a completely random choice. Also, that in noticing things like that, I really should get out more.
In the third and final strip of the crossover, Gobbledigook and Gump get into the tank, which leaves to fight some squats. And wow, do I wish the strip had shading all the time, because that added depth really lets this panel of utter chaos shine. Also, I will admit Squat Squad is very powerful, and turning me on. Don't put that in. Anyway, Goblin Hitler orders the use of a big bomb. Sorry, I mean he orders them to release der Otto mit der Groß Boom Boom, which ends up accidentally blowing up the tank and sending the two goblins back through the dimensional toilet to their own dimension. After this peak, the strip became much more infrequent and inconsistent in format. It really feels like after the big 3-strip special, they didn't really know what to do with it. In issue 102, there was this simple strip where he saunters through several GW games, but without any real punchline. The next one is supposed to be a dream, where we see him in the world of the car combat game Dark Future. And as neat as it is to see some mixed media work going on, it comes across more of a page of doodles than a comic, really. Oh, and by the way, that does appear to be Bill Sedgwick himself there, if you're wondering. Say hello, Bill. Hello.
Eventually there would be some more proper strips though, one where he gets punched by hobgoblins, and one where Nurgle himself drops a Nurgling on him, which Gobbledigook promptly eats before a lot of nose-based shenanigans happen.
And that's about it. The comic just sort of petered out after being a consistent part of White Dwarf for nearly 6 years, and unlike the other old long-running comic, Thrud, it didn't really seem to have much of a legacy either.
Although that's not to say that Gobbledigook didn't have any appearances outside of his strip. You could get him on a t-shirt, on his own or with other White Dwarf characters. There were rules printed for him for AD&D and RuneQuest in the Fiend Factory column. He popped up in promotional material a few times, and he even got a miniature, a very cute miniature that came with a little nibble in the White Dwarf Personalities box, along with the likes of Thrud, the White Dwarf himself, and Ian Livingstone. Sadly, we can't seem to find much info on what's become of Bill Sedgwick after Gobbledigook wrapped up, although he did do a bunch of art and design work for Games Workshop outside of Gobbledigook, such as getting credits in Rogue Trader, Space Marine, the epic thing, not the video game, The Fury of Dracula, and, perhaps most prominently, the Troll games GW made in the late 80s, whose artwork should look very familiar to you after sitting through this video. Also, if anyone has a copy of Oi That's My Leg that they're looking to offload, hit us up, okay?
Nowadays, there's remarkably little information about this strip online, with only a couple of the individual comics easily available, and searches mostly just come up with results for an entirely unrelated comic with the same name but spelled differently. There's so little of the strip online that we decided to put all the strips we could find in a Google Drive folder, so if you want to have a read of them yourself without tracking all the issues of White Dwarf down, you can! Link in the description. We think we've got all of them in there, but if we are missing some, then feel free to shout at us on social media and we'll add them if we can. So, that was Gobbledigook, a comic strip that was often more confusing than it was funny.
But regardless of what we may think, it is a little bit of Games Workshop and comic history, and that violent little goblin was around for the formative years of Warhammer, so it affected the tone of White Dwarf around that era.
It could have been worse. He could have called you a spotty Herbert.
This is true.
Oh hello, didn't see you there. Thank you for watching to the end of this video that continues our theme of finding out how niche a video needs to be before everyone stops watching. We appreciate it. If you wish to enable such behaviour, consider giving the video a like or subscribing to the channel, or maybe, just maybe, leaving a cheeky comment down below. Thanks to Longfang for providing some extra voice lines for us, and to Alfarius, Snakeworks Studio, William Robinson and Jeff Hopkin for helping us track down some of the Gobbledigook strips. If you'd like to support the creation of videos like this and see your name scroll past at the end, then throwing us $1 or $2 over at patreon.com/snipeandwib can make both of those dreams come true. There's also merch available should you wish to acquire physical proof of our existence. Bye.